in the crazy wide world of professional wrestling. Many upon many things have occurred across multiple territories, multiple continents, over multiple decades. Certain things that make you wonder, what if things had been different in this particular territory? What if this wrestler had never started? What if this wrestler had never left? What if this wrestler had won this championship? What if this wrestler had never won this championship? What if this particular territory still had their creative staff, still had everybody that they needed, still had their head booker, their head trainers? What if there wasn't a mass exodus? What if people said, we're going to stick around, we're going to dig our heels in, and we're going to continue to fight? We're not going to go to greener pastures. We're going to continue to fight for the established territory. But in this case, let's talk about what would have happened if a particular wrestler had said, you know what, I'm going to do what the promoter wants me to do. I'm going to do something, I'm going to change things up, and I'm going to see what happens. And that's what this video is about. I'm John Reitman with my real honest thoughts on what if Bob Backlund hadn't left the WWF in 1984. So this is more just, a little bit of history and just a lot of fun, because for those that, well, if you're like me, and I know I am, and you studied up on some of this stuff or just researched a little bit, you know that Bob Backlund, who was the, at the time, Worldwide Wrestling Federation and then became the WWF champion, when Vince McMahon bought the company from his father for a sweetheart deal, I believe for like $1 million in change in 1982, Bob Backlund was in the midst of a lengthy reign. He had won it from Superstar Billy Graham in February of 1978, ending Superstar Billy Graham's reign way, way before it should have been ended, in all honesty, but that's how Vince Sr. booked things out. He wanted to make Bob Backlund the, good guy, white meat baby face, the all-American boy. We're all American boys. If you're a long-time fan, then you'll probably have the Fabulous Rougeaus theme stuck in your head. The whole point is Backlund held the championship until just very late 83 when the Iron Sheik won it, and part of the reason for that is because Vince McMahon had made a deal to bring Hulk Hogan in, and Hulk Hogan became the champion, being the Iron Sheik not even a month later, and Hulkamania continued to grow in professional wrestling when it had already been established in the AWA. And actually, I'm going to do a video about Hulk Hogan if he hadn't left the AWA a little bit later. But for Bob Backlund, he would stick around the company for a number of months, and a lot of people seem to think that, Bob Backlund just disappeared from wrestling. Actually, that's not necessarily true. Those that were tape traders and those that kept up on the things through the newsletters and things, and if you had certain, TV access, you were able to see him on Pro Wrestling USA when the NWA and the AWA were trying to do co-promoted shows. It didn't really work, like Super Clash 1, which was a great idea, but didn't quite lead to the working relationship that they thought. And Backlund worked in Japan, and it really, really did work whenever he was over there for his stints. He also wanted to be more of a family man because he had children. He wanted to, be there for them, and that's actually part of the reason why he left the WWF in 1984. And then he became Mr. Backlund, the vicious heel that Vince wanted him to become in 1994, and the rest was history. And even though by that point Backlund was in his mid-40s, he was easily one of the craziest and oddly one of the most charismatic wrestlers, because he was just nuts. He was just goddamn nuts at that point. He got it. He got the entertainment aspect. But to look back in history, Bob Backlund, tremendous talent. Tremendous talent. The fact that he was able to go to TNA in 2007 and even have a few matches, and he was approaching 60 at that point. He was still, I think he was like 57, 58. He was able to do incredible shit there. And yeah, maybe it didn't necessarily translate to to an audience that probably knew the history of wrestling but hadn't seen Backlund in a number of years. But my God, I mean, the fact that he could move that well, he always kept himself in great shape, so doing the steps and doing the running, just doing the cardio, and keeping himself in such great shape. There are a lot of factors that led to Backlund losing the championship and not wanting to turn heel and all that. But let's look at the history, since I just gave an overlay there. He was born in August of 1949, Princeton, Minnesota, and married a woman that he's still married to this day, I'm assuming. I mean, I don't believe she passed away. His wife, Corky. I don't know why Corky is a funny name to me, but it just is. And he was trained by Eddie Sharkey, who's most famous or just as famous for training the Road Warriors and a few others, Scott Norton, and that was talked about in the Dark Side of the Ring episode about the Road Warriors. I was amazed that Eddie Sharkey was still alive when they did those interviews, and he debuted in 1973. So you got to think, 25, 26 years old, this guy getting in here, a legit, amateur hotshot, really, really talented, great in the ring, great to watch, the workout freak that he was. He started in the AWA, or that was where one of his first big breaks came from. And you could absolutely see why Vern Gagne would love a talent like Bob Backlund. And sure, Backlund was a number of years younger than him. Gagne was born in 26, 27, and Backlund was born in 49. But you can see why he was beloved there. And he would wrestle in Georgia Championship Wrestling. He'd win the NWA Missouri Heavyweight Championship. He'd wrestle in Texas. And you would have to think that working either in World Class or in Amarillo for the Funks, like him versus Dory Funk Jr., him versus Terry Funk. Shut up and take my money, especially at that point, even in the beginning, the infancy rather, of his career. And then he wrestled in Florida. And you could absolutely, and again, and this is going to be a recurring theme, you can see why Eddie Graham would love Bob Backlund. How could you not want to make money with this guy? And sure, he was very quiet, reserved, but he was capable of snapping. He was capable of getting upset, and he was capable basically of snapping your limb if he wanted to. But he was also professional, and he was also great. And at that point, Championship Wrestling from Florida, you had the stuff with Dusty Rhodes being the top babyface after 1974, 75, I think it was 74. He was a big star there, the big star. Bob Backlund would have been just as over, but I don't think he wasn't there as long. As long as others. And then there was talk because Bruno had come back for a second run as champion, and he had less dates, but after that 7.5-year run that he had from like 63 to like early 71, he did his shots, he did his stuff. He worked out in LA, he worked in Texas and other places, but he was mostly semi-retired. And then he came back because Vince Sr. needed somebody because I forget what it was. It was Ivan Koloff to beat him and then Pedro Morales to beat him. And Pedro was doing great, but Pedro also because of the Puerto Rican audience, because of just how passionate they are about professional wrestling, when they were having some riots. Anytime anybody got any heat or any steam by beating up Pedro, there would be near riots or at times riots. And then Bruno and Pedro had their match in Shea Stadium. I want to say that was in the 70s, I believe, because I don't believe it was the 1980 show, if I recall correctly, and there are a few factors for that. I think it rained, so they probably should have gone to the Garden, and they should have done that. But Backlund, going back to him, was somebody that Vince Sr. saw as being his next top guy, his next champion. And he was brought in 1976. Now, meanwhile, Pedro is still in the midst of his 3.5, 4-year run. I think it was near 4 years. I'm trying to remember the exact dates. I remember it was right around 4 years that he held it for. So, oh God, he didn't hold. What a flop. He only held it for about half the time that he had it before. But no, Pedro was a draw too. But Bruno was a big draw. Of course he was. Italian audience, and he he was able to help expand the reach and the help the growth of the company. Now Backlund comes in 1976, late 76. Terry, after working with Terry Funk and working with all these great people, and Eddie Graham basically saying, hey, this guy could really be a great hand for you. This guy could really be somebody. And he was around the table. Vince Sr. was with Gorilla Monsoon and others. I think it was Bruno even that said, this guy isn't going to draw you much as champion. I don't remember the exact quote. It's not that Bruno didn't respect his talent. I just don't think that Bruno saw him as a draw. And to be fair, you go from Bruno to Sean, let's see, what was it? Was it Sean Stasiak? Because you went from Pedro to Sean Stasiak, and then we went to Bruno. And then you went to Superstar Billy Graham. And Superstar Billy Graham, as far as his charisma, as far as his physical charisma, his ability to talk, and his ability to carry himself, and his ability, just look at the guy, and his promos, he would be able to carry it. His ring work always sucked. Like, you take a look at it, and you're like, even with modern eye, even if you try to transport yourself back there, no, Superstar Billy Graham was not great, but he didn't have to do a lot to get by. And he won it on April. It was April of '77, 16th, 20th, 23rd, and somewhere in that range. And he was supposed to hold it for a year and a half. That was the rumor. He was going to hold it for a year and a half, so he was going to hold it till like October of '78, and he was going to drop it to Backlund because plans had already been made. Vince Sr. was like, "Oh, okay, everybody doesn't think that I can make this guy a champion. I will make him a champion." Billy Graham, unfortunately, for Vince Sr., was starting to get over to the point where they could have turned him babyface. He could have actually had a big reign. And Backlund kept getting shots at him in '77, but unsuccessful. It was count-out victories, disqualifications, that kind of stuff. And Backlund continued to rise up the ranks and continued to impress people because how could you, again, not be impressed by Bob Backlund? Well, eventually he did win it on February 20th, 1978 from Billy Graham. And the thing is Billy Graham, after that point, self-destructed, and let's be perfectly honest, Billy Graham has exposed himself as a piece of shit, but if we look just at that in a vacuum, Billy Graham probably should have held the championship longer. That's no disrespect to Bob Backlund. But Bob Backlund won it there and would hold it. Imagine if they hadn't been able to get Hogan. Backlund might have held it for another few months to have a 6-year reign. They might have had to have Backlund challenge Bruno's reign. But we'll never know because it never happened. He feuded with various people. This is when the Worldwide Wrestling Federation is separated from the NWA. They rejoined the NWA in the early 70s? Early 70s, mid 70s, something like that. They had separated in 62, 63 after Buddy Rogers lost it to Bruno and they had their own champion. They had their own stuff. And that's a whole other story for another day. But Backlund became the champion. He would feud, and since they were rejoining the NWA, or rejoined the NWA, he feuded with Harley Race, champion versus champion. Obviously, it went to a time limit draw, but Backlund versus Harley Race, even a 60-minute time limit draw, there would be some cool shit to see in that. And I know that WWE put up various old school, aka house show matches or house shows in full on the cock, so I'll have to check that out at some point. But he even faced AWA champion Nick Bockwinkel, which would have just been a classic to see. Ric Flair when he was NWA champion. Billy Robinson in 1982, even though Billy Robinson by that point was on the downside of his career, he feuded with Inoki in Japan because Inoki and WWE had a working agreement. Yes, I'm going to say WWF a lot, by the way. The shirt was bought by my sister, and then she painted the logo. She looked it up online and said, I'll do that, and it's a cherished possession that is, I'm going to show it again. So, he feuded with Pat Patterson. He had great matches. He was having great matches. He was doing good as champion for a while. But you have to think about it. Again, the Bruno reign was 7.5 years. Then Ivan Koloff, temporary reign, few weeks, if that. Pedro Morales, 2.5 years. Stan Stasiak, 9-10 days. Bruno for 3.5-4 years. Superstar Billy Graham for just under a year. Vince McMahon Sr. wanted to have it back to normal, and even though Vince Jr. was getting more like power in the company, so to speak, he set up Titan Sports in 1980, and he was doing his stuff and setting and picking up the pieces. Pick up the pieces. Still Vince Sr.'s company. Vince Jr. says he would have turned Graham babyface, kept it on and stuff like that, and would have done other things. Again, we'll never know. But Backlund continued to roll as champion, even if there were some markets who were getting a little bit sick, that maybe, the All-American Boy. He even faced Hogan in a series of matches in 1980, and that's when Hogan was a heel. Hogan had just broken into wrestling a couple years prior. And I worked in Memphis, worked in Alabama, and worked in Georgia, I believe. And he was a heel. Classy Freddie Blassie was his manager. Who was in Hogan at that point, he was the big monster guy. He was in great shape, But part of the reason that all of the stuff got blown up with Hogan is because after that Shea Stadium match, where he faced Andre and slammed Andre, but he never slammed Andre before Mania 3. Even though it happened in their own company, he feuded with Hogan. But Hogan ended up leaving because he wanted to do Rocky 3, and Vince Sr. got upset and all that. And the fans started to basically turn on Backlund, not in 81. In 81, he would face various other heels. But I think he even faced Slaughter, because Slaughter was a heel at one point, before he turned face against the Iron Sheik. Once Snuka arrived sometime in 81, 82, I think about 82, then people saw this wild-eyed, crazy, ripped, guy from the Fiji Islands who murdered Nancy Argentino, by the way, in May of 83, and fuck Jimmy Snuka, I'm glad he's dead. He deserved a rotten hell for that. He deserved a rotten jail for what he goddamn did and what he goddamn got away with. But once Snuka came in, people saw something different, and it wasn't that they hated Backlund. I don't think they hated or turned on Backlund so much as they turned on to Snuka. And then we have the stuff in 83 where he had cut his hair, and he had started wearing a singlet. He had lost not even lost muscle mass, but he had trimmed down and stuff like that. And he was referred to as Howdy Doody, which, I mean, if you look at Howdy Doody and look at how Backlund looked in 83, kind of accurate comparisons. Unfair to Backlund because he'd been doing great stuff as champion. Fans were turning on. They liked Snuka. They were liking some of these other people that came in. And also, there was some crossover appeal. Some people were aware of Hogan. Now, maybe not as many as were aware of WWF television, but once Vince was able to get Hogan, he wanted Backlund to turn heel and face off against Hogan and possibly lose it to him, on a big show. And it would have been just a month under being able to have a 2-month, or if not 2-month, but a 6-year reign. And Backlund didn't want to turn heel. Okay. He didn't want to turn heel, and that probably soured Vince Jr. on that. And since he lost to Iron Sheik on December 26, 1983, he was able to do all the stuff that he did for a few months. I think like his last match was in August of 84. And then he would go to Pro Wrestling USA, all that stuff and everything. But what if he hadn't left in 1984? And these are just a few scenarios, because this video's already gone to a lot of history and a lot of whatever and a lot of what ifs. But you take a look at what if Bob Backlund had not turned, what if he had stayed face and stayed in the company past that point? What if he'd been able to come up with a contract negotiation, say, okay, Vince, I'll stay here. Let's maybe eventually turn heel, but I want to stay face for now. He could have teamed with Hogan, and it could have been former champion and current champion, and you could have led to a heel run at some point. And it could have been a superpower team, former champion, current champion against Iron Sheik and whoever. I mean, it could have been Iron Sheik and somebody, even though Sheik and Slaughter were a hot feud, and Snuka and Piper were a hot feud. You could have had like David Schultz and a couple other heels. You could have had some things going on. He could have challenged for the Intercontinental Championship, because he could have been so despondent, and you could have just been so upset. But then it's like, Greg Valentine wins it and says, he says, I can beat any, I beat the current champion, I can beat any former champion, and then Backlund challenges him for that. He doesn't have to win it. And if Bob Backlund won the championship there, if Greg had only been a transitional champion, Backlund would have been an incredible Intercontinental champion for a couple years. And he could have found a partner and challenged for the tag titles. I mean, I don't know, he could have teamed with Slaughter. The tag team champions, at least by a little bit later in the year, were Dick Murdoch and Adrian Adonis. And he could have feuded with the Iron Sheik after he lost the title. And he challenged him in a few house show matches, but what I'm meaning is once Hogan won it, Sheik could have gone for revenge, Backlund could have come back, all this stuff, and he could have challenged him. And it could have been a number one contenders thing, and then you could have built to a possible heel turn with Backlund. There were things for Backlund to do, but realistically, I don't blame him for leaving in August of 1984, because what else was there for him to do? After he held the championship for nearly 6 fucking years, what else was there for him to do? Because there was a rock and wrestling connection. Backlund didn't want to turn heel. Backlund wanted to remain the goody two-shoes. You have to wonder what the hell it would have ended up being. What if Backlund turned heel? What if he hadn't left, and what if he had turned heel? What if he decided, okay, Vince, I'll turn heel? He loses to Hogan on January 23rd, 1984. And then he just snaps, and he wants to face him in a bunch of rematch. He just snaps. Because he's like, I was so close to having 6 years. I could have beaten Bruno's reign. I could have done this, and Hulk Hogan, you took it from me. He even said at one point in one of the promos, I think in like 80, in 80, 81, 82, it was like, about somebody he was feuding with. I don't remember who. I'm going to kill that son of a bitch. I think it was Peter Maivia, actually, now that I think about it, when they were a tag team. But he could have faced Hogan in a series of rematches, and I think they would have drawn. Because it would have been a heel Backlund. He would have been able to do his stuff, and he would have been able to make it work. And Hogan would have sold for him, and Hogan would have done it. It would have been mega business, maybe not, but would it have drawn? Yes, it would have. Because the fans would have said, okay, here's this guy that we thought, we were sick of, and now, okay, he wants to attack our new hero? No, fuck you, we want to see you get beat. He could have challenged Tito Santana for the Intercontinental Championship. He could have beaten Tito in February of 84. Even though Tito, I think, only had it for a little bit, and before losing it to Greg, Greg Valentine, as great as he was, Bob Backlund could have held it for like 6 to 8 months. Tito could have beat him, and then Greg could have beat him for it, or Greg may have never had the Intercontinental Championship, and in all honesty, different scenarios. Again, this is all fantasy booking, it's all craziness. But he could have challenged Tito Santana for it, and I think that would have been great, especially Tito at that point, motivated and still on the rise and everything. He could have feuded with Slaughter, because you think about it, Slaughter was feuding with the Sheik. Slaughter had done this thing. Well, it could have been Slaughter and a tag team partner against Sheik and Backlund. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. But he could have feuded with Slaughter, which would have actually been great. It would have been an incredible feud. Even if Slaughter would have ended up leaving, I believe, in late 84, early 85 because of the Hasbro deal, become the first living G.I. Joe. He could have teamed with Iron Sheik, and like I said, they could have both gone and torn apart everybody. They could have gone after Hogan and a partner of his choosing, Slaughter, possibly maybe Snuka, even though Snuka by 84 was really starting to lose it, and Snuka was feuding with Piper anyway. And the thing is that Backlund turns heel, you have to wonder how much would they be willing to bring in Piper. He could have teamed with David Schultz. Backlund could have. And it would have been great. He could have been somebody that worked with Piper. Teaming up with Piper. Even though Orndorff was great, Backlund being the former champion, a man that hates Hulk Hogan. Piper hates Hulk Hogan. It would have added to his credibility because it said, okay, here's this great champion. He's with Piper. Piper's a big goddamn deal, then we got to pay attention to Roddy Piper. There were a multitude of situations that you could have done with Bob Backlund. Do I blame him for leaving? No, I really don't. He didn't want to. He didn't want to turn heel and make it to where his kids would see him as a bad guy. But I also don't blame the idea of Vince trying to say, hey, you really should turn heel. You really should do this. Would Backlund have been buried? And would Backlund have been basically marginalized by the first WrestleMania? Just over a year later, possibly. Backlund could have been on the first Mania card, because you had to think about it. When he left in August of 84, everything was going up. He didn't have his first WrestleMania match until WrestleMania 9, because he came back in late 92 and then wrestled for over an hour in the 1993 Rumble. And even though I think he only eliminated like a few people, he still did pretty goddamn good, considering that they acted like, he hadn't been wrestling at all. Obviously, he kept himself in incredible shape, and age-wise, when he left, he was only 35. I think he was just under 35 when he left. So it's not like he was an old man then. It's not like he was an old man in 1993, 1992, 93 when he came back. And he became Mr. Backlund. He did all this stuff and everything. And the match with the Bret Hart didn't exactly work out all that great, but you just wonder what could have been if we could have had the 1994 Mr. Backlund character, even though it continued for a few years after that. You have to wonder what would have happened if we had had that in 1984. Would the fans have bought it? I think the fans would have bought it. Now, would he have lasted past the first Mania, second Mania? Possibly not. But it would have been interesting. He would have probably made a lot more money. Now I'm not saying that he got paid in peanuts once he left, but it just would have been an interesting scenario. So let me know your thoughts in the comments because I'm interested to see what do you think. Do you think it was a good idea? Do you think Backlund could have worked as a heel in '84? Let me know. Anyway, like, share, subscribe. Twitter handle, Hive handle, and Discord handle are in the description. I don't know how to use either of those last two. I barely know how to use Twitter. Anyway, I'm John Ricklin. I'll see you soon.